Greetings to all you people out there, and to this author circle event. And what a pleasure it is to be able to interview Scott Anderson, the author of this terrific new book, The Quiet Americans: Four CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, a Tragedy in Three Acts. So Scott is a war reporter and a foreign correspondent who's reported stories from quite a few countries around the world, a lot of them very dangerous places. He's the author of several works of nonfiction and fiction, most recently Lawrence in Arabia, a best-selling account of the meddling and bungling of the great powers in the Middle East during World War I. Scott, as some of you will recall, came to the Tuxedo Park Library to talk about that book. It was one of our best author circle events ever. And I think we can expect a similarly gripping and fascinating interview, this time on a subject closer to our time and to our national drama. I like the way the New York Times described the book in its very good review. They use the word enthralling, which will certainly be on the front of the paperback. The reviewer goes on to say, "It is impossible not to be a little swept up in the spectacle of this bygone era when intrepid individuals actually shaped history, even if it was often for the worse." I'd like to speak personally about The Quiet Americans first, if I may. It's published by my employer, Doubleday, and I read it in one big gulp. I'm a baby boomer born in 1950, and the Cold War, in its many shifting manifestations, was a presence in my life for my first 39 years. And I was enthralled by what I read historically, narratively, and in terms of sheer human drama. And it's lodged itself in my brain right there, next to David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, another masterful group portrait of American power and hubris. I mean, in both books, you witness a spectacle of really smart, really idealistic Americans looking to project our power and prestige around the world for our own good, national good, and for that of the world, and with a lot of unintended consequences. It really is that good, and I hope you'll all take the opportunity to buy it and read it and ponder its lessons, which are really worth pondering. So thank you, Scott, for giving us the gift of your time.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's great to have you here. I thought it would be good for you to maybe read just a short portion of your book so people can hear in their head what the book sounds like on the page. So
sure, absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Jerry. I was going to, as you mentioned, I track it's the story of the early Cold War from about the end of World War II, from 1944 to 1956. And there was this period when, in 1944, FDR was talking about, victory in World War II was going to mean the end of the age of imperial powers, especially in Britain and France. And America was going to be this herald of democracy around the world, in the developing world. And then by the time you get to 12 years later, now the United States is actually propping up the imperial powers around the world and bankrolling them in places like Southeast Asia with the French and the British in Africa. And we're overthrowing democratic regimes rather than fostering them. So I wanted to focus in on this period because I think so much of what happened in the Cold War was really locked into place during this 12-year period. But I'm always interested in telling history through the eyes of people who are participants and people on the ground. So I really focus in on these four CIA officers who were operating in different theaters. And kind of tell this history largely through their analysis and their eyewitness accounts of things. So I'm just going to read about, as I said, there's four main characters. I'm going to read an introduction to one of them, a man named Michael Burke. And at one point, actually, I think it's in the part I'm going to read, I described Michael Burke as James Bond before James Bond existed. So I'll read this introduction to him. Many people have exciting and varied lives. And then there was Edmund Michael Burke, star athlete, Black Ops commando, Hollywood screenwriter, ladies' man, spy. Some of the other highlights of his diverse resume: maritime insurance investigator, baseball team president, media executive, circus manager. On a personal level, friends with Ava Gardner, Muhammad Ali, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Drinking buddy of Ernest Hemingway, Gary Cooper, and Mickey Mantle. During one particularly hectic stretch in his spying days, his social circle included a lively group of aspiring filmmakers, an even livelier group of aspiring paramilitary assassins. And such were the demands of his profession that he often had to entertain both in the same day. Charismatic, suave, and possessive Black Irish good looks, in essence, Michael Burke was James Bond before James Bond existed. Not that everyone knew him by that name. During the same period, he was known to many as Randolph R. Northwood, and he was a movie producer in Italy, or a political advisor in Germany, or a businessman dabbling in the import-export trade in Greece. Amid the ever-changing subterfuges, however, there were certain constants. One was Burke's taste for the good life. Another was his disdain for the shoulder holster. In his opinion, that accessory was best suited for beefy men wearing shapeless suits, whereas to conceal a gun in his own slender and well-tailored frame, he said, "I found the pocket of a trench coat or the barrels tucked into the waistband of my trousers suited me better." In looking back at the fantastically improbable turns of his life, at the journey that would take him from a rural Connecticut childhood to the darkest corners of the Cold War espionage world, and then on to the most rarefied reaches of New York high society, Burke would modestly attribute most of it to dumb luck, to simply being in the right place at the right time. In fact, he would title his autobiography, Outrageous Good Fortune. There was clearly more to it than that, though, because no one enjoys good luck so consistently as did Michael Burke. Vast and fortune quite so outrageous.
So that's what the book sounds like, and some people, some New Yorkers, I think especially, will remember Michael Burke from the 70s and 80s when he was screwing up New York sports franchises left and right. But he's absolutely as riveting a character as you claim, and he comes across in the book exactly that way. We'll get back to him. So let's. I think we might begin with the aerial view. So the CIA and the Cold War were coterminous and symbiotic. So tell us about how the CIA was created out of the, not the rubble, but evolved out of the OSS, which was the spy agency during World War II. And what were the historical circumstances that brought it into being? Right. What was its mission?
Right. So the OSS, all four of the men I follow, they were all in the OSS during World War II. The OSS was America's first international intelligence agency. Prior to World War II, we had nothing like it. Immediately afterward, just months after the end of World War II, in the summer of 1945, President Truman shut down the OSS, and a few of the units of the OSS were transferred to the State Department. Other ones were transferred to the Defense Department, War Department at the time. But it was really this idea that Truman had that we will be able to, our wartime alliance with the Soviets will continue, and we will work together to kind of create this new post-war world order. Very, very quickly, it was clear that was not, the Soviets did not have the same idea. By the end of World War II, they had essentially taken over all of Eastern Europe. They were in the process of establishing essentially Soviet puppet regimes throughout the region. My personal feeling is that Truman was very slow to the mark of appreciating that we were now in a new type of confrontation, a new type of war with the Soviets. So he created the CIA finally in 1947. And then a year later created what is called the Office of Policy Coordination, which was the covert operations branch of the CIA. The name deliberately chosen for how boring and bureaucratic it sounds. And the name itself, it was such a secretive organization that even the name OPC was classified for the next 25 years. It did not officially exist. So to give you an example of just how slow the Truman administration was to realize kind of the danger they were in. One of the other people I follow and he was actually still alive. He's 98 years old. He lives here in New York City. Peter Sichel. He was in the OSS during World War II. He is sent to Berlin in the fall of 1945. The war is just over for a few months. And Berlin is already becoming the epicenter of the growing confrontation at that point between the Soviets and the Americans. Thousands of Soviet intelligence officers are in Berlin. Peter Sichel goes, he's the head of a 9-man unit. It's the only covert operations unit of the Americans in Berlin. And he's just turned 23 and he's running the show. So really, and he's a brilliant man, not to take anything away from Peter Sichel, but it really kind of shows you just how clueless the Americans were at that point. By 1947, as I said, the CIA was created. The Truman Doctrine comes out, which they're rushing aid to Greece and to Turkey, the Americans, because they're both embattled by Soviet encroachment. And it from that point on, the Cold War is really gets up and going. The following year, 1948, you have the Berlin blockade, where the Soviets try to essentially starve the Western powers out of their occupation zones in Berlin. And then 2 years later, you have the Korean War, which the CIA never saw coming. It really underscored how implacable the conflict now was with the Soviets, but also how flat-footed again the Americans were caught, having never seen this coming.
So, okay, well, I think we can take our U-2 spy plane and go from the aerial view down to the ground level and get into your 4 protagonists. And we'll get back to Mike Burke in a second, but let's talk about Peter Sichel for a second. Just this is trivia, but not uninteresting. If that name sounds familiar to some people out there who know something about wine, he ended up becoming a brilliant wine importer, Sichel importer, and he was the genius behind Blue Nun, which
right.
was like the fancy wine of the 1970s. But that was later. He was a German emigre, I understand. And he came to, I believe he came to the attention of the American intelligence services because he was a kind of genius at manipulating black market currency.
That's right. So he was a German immigrant from a German Jewish family. So got to the States when he was 19, just before the war, before the Americans came into the war. So he was brought in by the OSS because, of course, he was a fluent German speaker, native German speaker. His first job with the OSS is he's an international black market currency trader. And one thing I had never really thought about before, but if you're dropping commandos behind enemy lines, those commandos need money, and they need the money that's in local circulation. So all through the war, there was this very complicated and fascinating transfer of funds. So if you were dropping commandos into Nazi-held Italy, you needed the sort of Italian lira that was being used at the time. So Peter did the currency trading for about 2 years. When after D-Day, in the kind of the fall of 1944, when the line sort of froze up between the Americans and the Germans in central France, he then became in charge of infiltrating German POW volunteers who agreed to go into Nazi-held France and spy, and then to bring them back. And it was this fascinating way they would do this, where the front line was quite static. This is in the Alsace-Lorraine area. So what the Americans would do, they would hide one of these men who was going to be going across. They would hide him in a basement of a farmhouse, and they would pull their front line back, and the Germans would come and push 300 yards forward. The spy would come out and he would go into Nazi-held territory, and then they had to do the same thing in reverse to get the men back. So it just incredibly intricate and obviously very perilous for the men involved operation, and Peter kind of ran that. And then, as I said, once the war was over, because he had his nickname was the Wunderkind, the Wonder Child, and it was thought of so highly that then they made him the head covert operations officer in Berlin.
And he had a talent for it, obviously, and I believe he eventually became something like head of station in Berlin, and was running quite a few spy networks behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, so when he gets there in the fall of 1945, pretty quickly after, in about March of 46, Truman wants to have what's called an order of battle. He wants to find out what the Soviets are up to, the Soviet military in their zone of Eastern Germany, to see if they're having plans to actually push into Western Germany. So Peter, because Berlin is the kind of one place all along the Eastern Front that are already becoming sort of the Iron Curtain, it's the one open transit area. So Berlin becomes the place where this operation is carried out. And Peter oversaw this. It was called Operation Grail, and they ran something like 300 different local informants and spies throughout East Berlin and Eastern Germany to report on what the Russians were up to. And all his networks disappeared in essentially a 24-hour period. The Soviets had these networks compromised and infiltrated from the get-go, and virtually everyone disappeared overnight. As time went on, Sichel and the people under him became more sophisticated, and also kind of more morally compromised. They pretty early on realized that the people who understood best what was happening in Eastern Europe were former German military intelligence officers who'd served on the Eastern Front in World War II. So they start recruiting them, and including a number of people who were actually wanted for war crimes. Even though being a German Jew, Peter really didn't have much of a problem with that. This was a new war. What you did in the past war is between you and your conscience. You're working for me now. And one amazing operation he was involved with, there was a spy working for the Soviets who was running this entrapment scheme where they were pulling German civilians into East Berlin and then kidnapping them, either executing them or sending them to the gulags. And Peter and his men managed to flip this guy to work for the Americans, but to maintain his credentials with the Soviets, they had to allow this whole entrapment and kidnapping scheme to continue. And it got to a point where Peter's unit were protecting this guy operating this entrapment scheme from the American military authorities in Berlin who were trying to capture him because he disappeared so many people. So you very quickly get into some very morally complex issues.
We're in John Le Carré territory.
That's right. Very much so.
So when I want to get to the other part, but since you're in Berlin, there's this, and you're talking about moral compromise. There was an episode that Michael Burke, who also did some things in Germany, involving Alan Dulles, that I would like you to talk about.
Right.
that Alan Dulles, I if I believe, tried to get Michael Burke to provoke demonstrations, anti-communist demonstrations in
Right.
East Berlin, not for inspirational reasons, but for the purpose of having the demonstrators shot and killed, and therefore giving the United States a propaganda victory.
That's right. Yeah, it was actually John Foster Dulles. Alan Dulles was the head of the
Oh, it was
CIA.
John Foster?
Yeah, his
Oh, so
brother.
many Dulleses, so little
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
his brother, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of
All right.
State. So, and so basically, what had happened is in 1953, um, there was a spontaneous uprising in East Berlin that then spread throughout East Germany in the Soviet zone of demonstrations against the government. This kind of spontaneous uprising that was brutally crushed, and hundreds of civilians just machine gunned in the street. So that was in 1953. In early 1954, John Foster Dulles comes to Berlin. He meets with Michael Burke and the CIA station chief at the time, and he says, "Can you create a disturbance in East Berlin?" And at first he's very vague with Burke of what he wants, and Burke eventually gets out of him. He wants a replay of the riots and the killings that had happened a year before. Burke knows this is going to lead to wholesale slaughter in the streets, and as you said, John Foster Dulles just wanted to do this to, and at one point Burke says, "Well, yes, we can probably create something, but why would we do that?" And there's going to be casualties. And John Foster Dulles says, "Well, it would embarrass the Soviets." And that was really one of the key episodes for Michael Burke, where he decided to quit the CIA. And he quit the following year. He and the CIA station chief managed just to play beat the clock. Dulles was only in town for a few days, and they kind of hemmed and hawed and came back and said, "Oh yeah, we just didn't have enough time to organize it." But kind of from that moment on, Burke decided it was time to get out. And he'd had a difficult run up until then. He was in charge of airdropping anti-communist partisans behind the Iron Curtain, either infiltrating them by land
In
or
Albania, yes.
started in Albania, and then it was throughout Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and almost all these operations were utter disasters, just like Operation Grail earlier with Peter Sichel. The KGB had these operations infiltrated from the get-go, to the point where often when these commandos, if they were airdropped, they would have a welcoming party waiting for them right there, and they'd be executed or sent to the gulags, and they were uniformly disastrous.
So we're getting into the darker aspects of it, and I wanted to get to another one of your figures, Frank Wisner,
Right?
who is who had a tragic end, but he was the most paradigmatic, I think, of your figures in terms of the CIA profile. He was a WASP.
Right.
He got into intelligence where he was a very highly paid corporate lawyer for Carter Ledyard. But while Bill Donovan, the legendary OSS guy, recruited him, and he did a lot of intelligence work in the Second World War. But when the CIA came up, he rose through the ranks very quickly and became the head of what you call the OPC.
Yeah.
So tell us about him and what the arc of his career was.
Yeah, Wisner is a fascinating figure. I've always thought of something that Peter Sichel actually said about him, because Wisner is the head of OPC. So he's the number 2 man, arguably number 3 man of the entire CIA, but in charge of the covert operations wing of it. So technically, all these other men's superiors. At its heyday, the OPC was operating in some 50 countries around the world, and Wisner, its nickname was the Mighty Wurlitzer. and Wisner was, you can kind of predict the nickname, the Wiz. And it was everything from kind of hearts and minds, rather sophisticated operations in Western Europe. The idea in Western Europe is to kind of co-opt the intellectual center left. So they started the Paris Review. They brought they set up the overseas library program where you had libraries all throughout Western Germany.
They published a Counter magazine.
Yeah, and they brought Broadway shows to Germany. And this whole idea that to kind of show the superior freedom of expression of the West as opposed to the Soviet. Running all the way the gamut to overthrowing foreign governments, assassinating foreign politicians, and these kind of black ops of dropping partisans behind the lines. And Wisner was the man who was in charge of all of this. But I remember something that he was actually the one who recruited Peter Sichel for the Berlin Post in the waning days of World War II. And he liked Frank Wisner a lot. He said, but the thing that always puzzled me about Frank was very emotional, and he took things personally. And in this game, you can never take things personally. And certainly Sichel was an example of that. Just a very kind of pragmatic and rather cold-blooded guy. But Wisner became very emotionally involved in operations. And so he really took it personally and kind of grieved when so many of these operations turned into disasters, and so many of these people, especially these Eastern European operations, just vanished off the face of the earth.
Well, perhaps not too surprisingly, I guess, he became a subject of a campaign against him by J. Edgar Hoover.
That's right.
Who didn't like the idea of another player.
That's right.
Player. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's kind of there's kind of a parallel theme in this book of how. So J. Edgar Hoover always dreamed of the FBI would be the international intelligence agency, and he never forgave Truman for denying him that and creating the CIA. So Hoover was always out to put the knife in the CIA however he could, and he had a special animus for Wisner. Wisner had a wartime dalliance with a princess in Romania, and this dalliance came back to haunt him for the rest of his professional life. Whenever Wisner was, at one point Wisner was looking like he might become the next CIA director, and Hoover immediately launched another, this was probably the fourth round of investigations into Wisner's background with this Romanian woman. And this was right when Eisenhower was coming in 1952, and it was clearly designed, this new investigation of Wisner was clearly designed to send a message to Eisenhower that if you appoint this guy as CIA director, I'm going to come after him, and it's going to be a huge embarrassment for you. But so Wisner was stalked throughout his professional life, and the incredible irony of this, he was the paradigm of the anti-communist fighter, but constantly questioned, constantly under investigation as soft on communism.
Well, I want to come back to him at the end and his unfortunate end, but which is connected to the unfortunate end of this book.
Right.
But let's go to your fourth spy, who's kind of an outlier, but a truly fabulous and consequential character by the name of Edward Gary Lansdale.
Right.
Who, as you say in the book, he was a San Francisco ad man who didn't have what they called a good war,
right,
but he had a very good post-war.
Right.
And unlike your three characters, he worked in the Asian theater,
right,
which was the dynamic of intelligence, and was quite different. And he was the architect of counterinsurgency.
Right.
and turned out he was really quite good at it, and he proved that in the Philippines. So tell
Yeah,
us about him.
yeah. So Lansdale, he became known as the miracle worker of Asia. So immediately after the war was over, he stuck stateside throughout World War II. He gets shipped off to the Philippines right after the end of the war. The Philippines is essentially an American colony, and it's ruled by the very kind of corrupt oligarchy that has controlled the country for a number of years, and which has helped fuel a kind of rural communist insurgency that's just getting kind of heating up.
Yeah, the Hunk insurgent, the Hunk
The
rebellion.
hooks, yeah,
Yeah,
the hook bala hops, or yeah.
yeah.
So Lansdale has this very simple idea, but revolutionary for the time, of that if you want to win over the local populace, you have to give them something to believe in, and you have to give them a government that answers to them. You have to give them a stake in the system, and that is something that just never existed in Filipino society. So he finds an obscure Filipino senator, a man named Rabin Magsaysay, and engineers for him to be named the defense minister. And together they reform the Filipino military. Instead of this kind of death squad military that had been before, where if there was an attack by the hooks, the military would come in and just conduct an indiscriminate massacre. He launched this whole kind of hearts and minds campaign where the military, along with hunting down the hooks, were also, in their spare time, they were refurbishing schools and clinics, and actually at times even helping bring in the harvest. So they were seen as an army of the people for the first time, and it had this profound effect on the communist insurgency. And in fact, the Hook insurgency kind of collapsed after about 2 years, from a point where it really looked like they might take over the Philippines, and it was just almost completely wiped out within 2 years.
Well, to the literary-minded folks in the audience, they should know that Lieutenant Colonel Lansdale eventually took his Hearts and Minds campaign to Vietnam,
Right.
And he certainly he drew the attention of a pretty good novelist by the name of Graham Greene, who repurposed him as the character Alden Pyle in the book The Quiet American,
Right.
which of course gives you your title.
Right.
But he had a dark side and a devious side too, and would he, in addition to the Hearts and Minds model of counterinsurgency, he was a master of something that he called combat psy-war.
Right.
And would you please tell us the story of the vampire business in the Philippines?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. No, so the vampire story. So in the Philippines, there's this a superstition about the aswang, which is a kind of a vampire figure who lives up in the mountains and preys comes down and attacks villagers and kills them and drains their blood. So there was an area in the Philippines where the hooks were active. They're up on a mountainside, and they laid a trap for them at night, where they grabbed the soldiers working with Lansdale. They grabbed one of the hooks, they killed him, they drained his body of blood and left it in the trail. And so for the rest of the hooks to find the body the following day. And when they found the body, they were so terrified. It was proof that there was an aswang living on the mountain, so the hooks all left. And it was one of the darker episodes in Lansdale's path. It kind of goes to what he was a master at, and was actually listening to the local people. I mean, so that's a particularly brutal example of it. But in the 1950s Asia, I think what usually happened was the American military advisor, American political attaché would come in and just like lecture people of like what should happen. There wasn't a lot of listening going on. And this was kind of like Lansdale's secret. And with Magsaysay, the man he engineered as defense minister.
Ramon Magsaysay.
Right. He also engineered eventually for him to become the president. And he kind of became, the president whisperer to Magsaysay. And in 1954, with Magsaysay in the presidency and hugely popular, and the hooks kind of finished, he goes back, Lansdale goes back to Washington, and the CIA director says, you did such a great job in the Philippines. We've got a problem in another place in Asia, Vietnam. So just go to Vietnam and do the same thing you did in the Philippines. So he
should be easy.
Right, it's gonna be easy. So Lansdale goes out, and in fact, he actually comes very close to achieving the same thing. He becomes the confidant of the Vietnamese Prime Minister, Diem.
Yeah.
And Lansdale arrives in 1954 as the head of the first American military mission to Vietnam. And it's him and 12 other American military officers, soon to be followed, of course, by nearly 3 million others. But it almost worked. And really what you see with Vietnam, where it all kind of fell apart, was as more and more American military was coming in, and as Diem became a dictator, and the State Department and successive American administrations looked the other way, his regime became more and more unpopular, and it fed the communist insurgency. And Lansdale actually had a great, it's in the epilogue where someone said, in Vietnam, should Americans come in harder and faster than we did? Would that have made a difference? And Lansdale said, if I had a friend who had needed brain surgery, I wouldn't tell the doctor to use a sledgehammer and a heavier sledgehammer. As our problem in Vietnam was that we came in with so many soldiers, so much material. We had every advantage over the Viet Cong, that we never had to be smart. And we just thought we could shoot our way, bomb our way to success. And you don't win an insurgency that way.
So with the subject of Vietnam on the table provides a nice segue into the tragedy, the tragic theme of your book. And so it's not quite right to call these four men idealists. I mean, they got their hands dirty. A lot of people died as a result of their activities, either purposefully or accidentally,
Right.
But there was a real Soviet threat, and it had to be dealt with, and they were thrown into the fray to do it. But things got darker as the 50s, as you write, as the 50s came along, and oddly, they got darker still when Dwight Eisenhower became president, and it sounds like a fashion trend, his new look foreign policy.
Right.
In fact, I think that was a term of art at the time, fashion.
I think it was too.
New look. Tell us about the new look and where it led us.
Right. So when Truman came in, when Eisenhower came in, it was this idea of just let's re-examine our approach to the Cold War, and Truman Eisenhower came with this new look policy, and new look essentially was that the United States reserved the right for a nuclear first strike if its vital national security interests were threatened. The euphemism was massive retaliation, but it was, what they're talking about was a nuclear first strike. So of course the Soviets immediately, when the Americans come out with that publicly, the Soviets do the same thing. So now you have both powers reserving the right for a nuclear first strike. What no one seemed to kind of put together at the time, and I did an awful lot of reading around the new look policy, and new look actually did two things simultaneously. It froze in place the Iron Curtain in Europe, because now the Soviets couldn't make an incursion into, say, West Germany, because that was vital to American national security interests. You were going to be inviting a nuclear war. Likewise, the Americans couldn't go into Hungary or Poland without potentially triggering a nuclear war. So New Look locked the division of Europe in place for what would turn out to be the next 40 years.
I think it might be worth mentioning here that somewhere during this time, Stalin has died and Khrushchev has ascended to power, and he's made this astounding speech to the Politburo,
right,
denouncing so many of Stalin's policies. So there was a possible opening.
There's a huge, I'll just finish with the New Look, because the second part of the New Look was by locking Europe into place. What it also did was simultaneously open up the entire rest of the world as the playground for the Cold War, because Angola is not in anyone's vital national security interest. So let's cause mischief there, or Cambodia, or so it had the simultaneous thing of destabilizing the rest of the world and locking into place Europe. You talk about Khrushchev. So one of the great kind of awful turning points in history, to my mind, is that Stalin died 6 weeks after Eisenhower came into office, and John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, saw everything in black and white, and he around the world, you're either with us or you're against us. So the world was divided between friends and enemies. But more specifically, had this kind of crazy dichotomy of the way he viewed the Soviet Union, that any overture from the Soviets, that they were the evil empire. And any sign of an overture from the Soviets was kind of simultaneously a sign of that the Soviet empire was crumbling, was falling apart, but also a sign of the Soviets' ultimate evil intent, because by making an overture, what they were really trying to do, in Dulles' mind, was they were trying to lull the West into complacency and then strike. So you had Stalin's death in 1953. The junta in the Kremlin that's initially in charge. They within a week after Stalin dies, they send this message to the West saying we want peaceful coexistence. And Churchill, who's back to being prime minister in Britain, it urges Eisenhower to make a similar overture to the Soviets. Dulles vetoes it, saying no. It's the only reason they're doing this is because, again, they're weak. They're falling apart. Why do we accept one slice of bread when we're about to have the whole loaf? And also that this is just further proof of Soviet perfidy, and that happened with Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech. And it's continued on. So it was that period was this just enormous, to my mind, missed opportunity that you could have actually had the Cold War end 30 years before.
I want to interject to the people listening that you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your, just if you have questions, just throw them up there, and in about 10 minutes we'll open it up to questions for a few minutes. Well, that sort of brings us to the last act of which is the Hungarian Uprising, which is one of the most appalling episodes in American foreign policy. I'm editorializing, but I don't think you disagree.
No.
Tell us how that went down, and why it was connected to American intelligence activities and espionage activities in Europe.
Yeah, and I think the reason, I totally agree with you, Jerry, that one of the most ignominious moments of American foreign policy, and I think the reason most people know very little about it is because, every people kind of try to airbrush their history of their more shameful episodes, I guess. So Frank Wisner, who from 1945, 46, had always been his whole goal in all these operations that had been such failures in the Iron Curtain, he'd always dreamed of there being a spontaneous anti-communist revolt somewhere in the Soviet bloc. Throughout the late 40s and mid 50s, and it was ramped up under the Eisenhower administration from 52 on, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty were constantly sending these broadcasts into Eastern Europe encouraging people to rebel, saying America will help you. Well, you finally get a spontaneous anti-communist uprising in Hungary in October of 1956. CIA never saw it coming. I mean, it truly was spontaneous. In a single 24-hour period, it went from being student demonstrations against the government to full-scale insurrection. This is something that Wisner has been dreaming about for his entire professional life. He happens to be in Europe at the time. He goes to Vienna, next door to Hungary, and he's sending these cables back to Washington saying, these people, we're about to liberate Hungary. We have to help these people before the Soviets turn around and crush them. Completely fell on deaf ears. And again, it's Dulles and Eisenhower sitting back in Washington, and they're looking at the situation in Hungary, and New Look rears its ugly head. It's like if we try to come to the aid of the Hungarian freedom fighters, as they were called, we risk stepping into the Soviets' backyard, and we risk triggering a war that could lead to nuclear holocaust. So they do nothing, and they let the revolution, the Hungarian Revolution, be crushed. There's this crucial moment, and it plays to the way the story ends. October 29th, 1956. The insurrection in Hungary is so advanced that Khrushchev decides Hungary's lost, and he orders a ceasefire. The Soviet troops in Budapest, the capital, start leaving. The tanks are leaving. They're going back to the border. They've won, and there's all these spontaneous, celebrations in the streets of Budapest and other Hungarian cities. Overnight, Khrushchev changes his mind because he thinks if the Americans were going to do something to help the revolution, they would have done it by now. So the next day, he orders the tanks to turn around and go back, and they crush the revolution. Wisner happens to be in Vienna when this happens, and all these telegrams he sent back to the States, they've just been ignored. He's at the border as what ultimately is 200,000 Hungarians flee across into Austria to escape the Soviet Red Army. And he ends up having a nervous breakdown, which he really never kind of recovers from. He was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but it seems clear that this event of being a witness to the Hungarian tragedy sort of triggered that in him. He's kept on by the CIA, but he's kind of moved along to kind of a sort of a semi-retirement position. He has periodic bouts with bipolar disorder and gets electric shock treatments, and is just a very sad descent. He ends up committing suicide on October 29th, 1965, the 9th anniversary to the day that it looked like the Hungarian Revolution was going to succeed, which had been his lifelong professional dream. Coincidentally or not, if he chose that day, if that day weighed on him in a way.
So Peter Seashell also quit the CIA to improve American wine consumption in 1955 or 56.
1960 he left.
I'm sorry. Yeah. But for somewhat similar reasons, you would say, and we've already talked about Mike Burke leaving the CIA because of feeling dirtied by the outcomes of some of the things that he was doing. So the lesson is, wrap it up for us. I think I should also, you might talk about a couple of the other misadventures in American regime change in that time in Iran and Guatemala.
Right. Yeah. So what happened? With both Iran and Guatemala, Iran in 53 and then Guatemala the following year, neither of which were communist regimes. Both were democratically elected governments. But in the Eisenhower administration, First, in the case of Iran, they kind of bought into the British propaganda of the British had controlled the oil industry in Iran. Mossadegh, the prime minister, had nationalized the oil industry, so the British were out to get him. They convinced the Americans that waiting in the wings behind Mossadegh was the Iranian Communist Party. So they overthrow Mossadegh and reinstate the powers of the Shah, and all to come back to bite us on the ass 20 years hence with the Iranian Revolution. Guatemala, very similar situation. Arbenz is not a communist. He wants to. Essentially, Guatemala is owned by the Standard Fruit Company. It's the original kind of banana
United Fruit Company, yeah.
Yeah, and they convince the Eisenhower administration that Arbenz is a communist, and because he wants to institute agrarian reform, they overthrow Arbenz in Guatemala, sending Guatemala into the next 30 years of just brutal civil war and death squads that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and also inflaming the entire region. Really, by the time of the Eisenhower administration was over in 1960, they had either overthrown or tried to overthrow or tried to subvert governments in virtually every region and sub-region around the world. And America really had, by that time, certainly by 1960, was seen as an imperial power, just very much like the other imperial powers that had come before. So any image America had in 1944 as this kind of shining city on the hill, the beacon of democracy, that was all gone by 1960 and really never to return.
And yet, these four men, again, as I said, are not idealists, but they wanted to save the world in some sense. So what can we learn from their lives and their experience, and as Americans acting as historical actors in the world?
Well, it's a great question, and obviously that America needed to engage in some way to this, and the Soviet Union was a threat, especially under Stalin. I think what happened was that America just kind of got locked into this very reactive response to this just hailstorm of events that were happening around the world in the late 40s, early 50s. And this kind of taken over by this idea of we have to try something. Whatever might work, we will try. And if whatever might work is getting into bed with a brutal military dictator, well, we don't have the luxury of anything else. We'll do that. So I think that and at the same time, you had the domestic Red Scare that was happening in the States, which had a huge influence on foreign policy also of anything that might work to turn back the so-called communist tide. We have to try to do. And I think it was Peter Sichel had this great line. I actually end the book with this, where he said, he talked about his time in the CIA, and he said, it was a crusade. It was a romantic crusade. We were the good guys, the Soviets were the bad guys, and we went out to save the world from communism. And he said, but one thing we forgot was history, because what history tells us is that crusades always end badly.
But do they? I would actually like to throw the counter argument.
Yep.
So even if you have to acknowledge a number of terrible mistakes. I think the Vietnam War being the biggest and most terrible of them. But if you take the long view, immediately after World War II, there indeed was a global communist threat that Stalin had big plans, and you could argue whether Mao in China was better for China than what they had before, but in any case, it was unnerving. But by 1989, world communism was defeated.
Right.
we thought that would be the most wonderful thing in 100 years of peace, which didn't happen. But in any case, the Soviet Union was defeated. So we made some mistakes, but in the end, we did good.
Well, I mean, I would say it goes back to what I was saying before, was that if we had been sort of certainly if under the Eisenhower administration, if they had been not so locked into this defensive crouch that America had been in since the beginning of the Cold War, if there had been some subtlety, and if they had seen what was coming out of the Soviet Union when Khrushchev took over, when you look at what was happening in 1956, this reform movement that Khrushchev was trying to introduce first inside the Soviet Union, but then within Eastern Europe itself. It actually began in Poland. Poland kind of broke away a month before the Hungarian Revolution. They reconfigured their whole relationship with the Soviet Union. Then it spreads to Hungary. There's an eerie replay of what happened with Gorbachev in the 1980s, what was happening with Khrushchev 30 years earlier. And I think if the Americans had been quite a bit more supple and far-thinking, the Cold War could have ended 30 years earlier. And if the Cold War had ended 30 years earlier, and you think of what all would not have happened, Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, El Salvador. The other thing I'll say on that is that it's interesting that towards the end of Frank Wisner's life, he looked back on this mighty Wurlitzer that he ran, and what he recognized was the most effective anti-communist tools that he used. It wasn't the infiltration operations; those had all been disasters. But it was the soft power. It was the hearts and minds stuff. It was Radio Free Europe that broadcast into Eastern Europe. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, they became the most listened to radio stations throughout the Soviet bloc by the mid-1950s, and it continued in the 1950s.
It's our rock and roll.
Right, rock. Yeah, it's rock. Yeah. So I think it's an argument for that you could have done this quicker, and you could have done it with a lot less bloodshed.
Well, that's a good place for us to stop. I do have one question here from one of our listeners who said, "What led you to choose your four protagonists? How did you find them? And maybe were there other people that you considered but discarded for one reason or another?"
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's well, first of all, it wasn't completely gratuitous that I chose Spies, because as I got thinking, I was always been fascinated by this period of American history, and I got thinking of, well, who, in the Cold War, who were the people on the true front lines? Who were the eyewitnesses?
What was the front line?
Right, and it was spies. It was intelligence officers of both sides. So that kind of worked out because spies are kind of inherently interesting. But so when I decided on this template and this period I was looking at, I had this very short list of criteria of the people I wanted to find to build the story around, and it was people who had, well, had been doing cool stuff, interesting things around the world. And I wanted to, one in Asia at least, one in Europe, one back in Washington, Wisner of who's kind of the grand orchestrator. And I wanted them to be, their stories to have a kind of a narrative arc through this 12-year period. And I actually thought that from this very basic criteria, I would have 25, 30 people to kind of choose from. I ended up with 4. There were only 4 who met that criteria. I didn't have a 5th character to choose from. There were a lot of people who had. I was thinking of one in particular had kind of an amazing. He was in the CIA, an amazing 4 or 5 years, getting into all kinds of skullduggery. But then midway through, he goes and he's an economic officer at the American Embassy in Paris, and he sits there for the next 4 years. So what do I do with that? So I mean, at one point I was really we got kind of worried of whether the template was going to work, because I just was having a hard time finding people. And of course, finding Peter Sichel was just, he was the proverbial, chest of letters in the attic. I mean, to find him still alive and having been a really prominent actor.
And he was your deepest interviewee. I mean,
Yeah,
you
he
was your greatest source.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, our hour is up. I I wish I had the chance to ask you why you called George Kennan a weasel.
I could answer it really quickly if you want.
All right, tell me why you could. George Kennan, to students of American foreign policy, is the architect of the strategy of containment and one of the 3 or 4 most revered figures in American foreign policy history. Yet,
Right.
our author thinks he's a weasel. Mr. Anderson, why is George Kennan a weasel?
Two-faced weasel.
Two-faced weasel.
Well, I mean, brilliant man, and yes, kind of a brilliant architect of a number of things from a strategic standpoint. But from a personal standpoint, it was his brainchild to create the OPC, and engineered Frank Wisner to take the head of it. But as soon as Wisner took over, and this was going to be an incredibly controversial position, and there's going to be a lot of failures, obviously, he completely disavows any involvement with it. And so his whole idea of creating the OPC was that the American government needed plausible deniability. Plausible deniability, these operations around the world. But he took that very personally, of that he is just going to wash his hands of any involvement. So having created the OPC, having handpicked Wisner to run it, in his 900-page memoir, never mentions Wisner once, never mentions OPC. Or you might mention OPC once, but because
of two-faced weasel.
I know. See, there you go.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Scott. This
My
is
pleasure, Jerry. Thank you for having me.
It was so much fun talking to you, and this is what history looks like when you put people in it, and people try to make it. So, folks, buy the book, because I give you my personal guarantee you will not stop reading it until you're finished. All right.
All right. Thanks so much, Jerry.
All right. Take it easy.
Bye.
Bye.